Hello and welcome to Newsnight. I am Ladi Akeredoluale. It's our pleasure to have you join us today. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, now in its seventh week, is still at the top of the world's agenda and talking points. My guest on the program was in Ukraine at the height of the events preceding the Maidan Revolution, which he says the United States played a major role in and which led to the sequence of events presaging Russia's annexation of Crimea. My guest also thinks that Ukrainians firmly believe their lives will witness significant improvements, particularly economically, by aligning more with Western capitalist powers and are prepared to sacrifice a whole lot for that. Newsnight talks to Nigeria's former envoy to Ukraine, Ambassador Frank Isoh. Your Excellency, thank you for your time. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. My pleasure to be here once again.
Let's harken back a bit to the time that you were Nigeria's ambassador in Ukraine, which was when the lead up to all of this happened, the invasion or takeover of Crimea, the revolution, as it was called then, that ousted Viktor Yanukovych, who was president of Ukraine at that time, and then Russia's position in all of this. Could you give us, shall we say, an executive summary of the situation between Russia and Ukraine, say between 2010 and about 2014?
Very well. Thank you very much. In looking at that period, it will be pertinent to go a little bit back to 2004. If you allow me to do that, because...
Please go ahead.
It's a sequence. Yes. For a very long time after independence in 1991, it appeared as if the Ukrainians didn't have an idea what they wanted to do, while other former Soviet republics had a clear pathway towards what they wanted to be by aligning with the West. The Ukrainians were a bit confused and still continued their kind of relationship with the Russians. And the two presidents they had after independence, Leonid Kravchuk and Leonid Kuchma, were very, very pro-Russia. And for a very long time, Ukrainians were wondering why their lives had not changed since the days of the Soviet Union. So by 2004, when it was time for another election, there was a grand coalition of opposition parties, and they wanted to fight hard to remove the then government in power. During that election, there was no clear winner. The opposition had Viktor Yushchenko, a former prime minister, as a candidate, while the governing party had a certain Viktor Yanukovych as its candidate. Those two candidates came first and second, but none of them could get the 50% threshold required to be declared a winner. So there was a runoff. During that runoff, international observers and both domestic observers adjudged the election to be largely unfree, and as such, people rejected the outcome of that election, which had placed the government candidate as winner. So it had to take the intervention of the Supreme Court to determine the winner of that election. But then the Supreme Court, after going through all the evidence before it, decided that the election was neither free nor fair and called for a second runoff. And during that second runoff, in early 2005, the opposition candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, was declared the winner. And for the very first time, Russia was alarmed that Ukraine was gradually slipping away from its orbit. And what she did then was to gradually destabilize that government. And throughout this 5-year tenure, that government could not critically address the problems of Ukraine. But it did achieve two things. One, it started an association agreement with the EU. Secondly, it was able to achieve what is called a membership action plan with NATO. So with these two agreements, it was obvious that Ukraine had defined where it wanted to be, who its friends, ought to be. But then, because it couldn't do anything to address the perilous economic situation in the country, the government was ousted in the 2010 election. That's coming back to the period you now asked the question. Yanukovych won that election and became the president. His pro-Russian stance was very clear. It was never in doubt. But then the people had already decided among themselves that they wanted to go pro-West. Now, the ongoing discussion on the association agreement with the EU was being stalled by the new government at the behest of Russia. So no progress was made in reaching an agreement with the EU. By 2013 November, it became very clear that the government was out to cancel that agreement, and that's exactly what it did. And the moment it did that, there was this uproar, which led to the Euromaidan protest. The Maidan is the Independence Square in Kyiv. And this continued for 3 months, up to February 2014, when the president was ousted in a civilian coup. There was no doubt that the West was actively involved in that protest. The current undersecretary in the present Democratic government in the United States, Victoria Nuland, was the point person for the Obama administration. She was then the Assistant Secretary for European and Eurasian Affairs. Essentially, it was our duty to make sure that the protesters were supported by the West, and that's exactly what they did. So when this president was ousted, clearly, Ukraine now swung to the West, and that did not go down well with Russia. But nobody knew what Russia had in mind then until March 2014, when she now invaded and occupied Crimea. And by April, it added to the confusion by fomenting rebellion in the east of Ukraine, particularly in the Donbas region. That's exactly what happened. And that is the genesis of the crisis we're facing today.
So essentially, the various powers, Russia, the United States, the EU, NATO, and all of that, had been involved in one way or the other, either directly or indirectly, in the run-up to what we are witnessing today in 2022. That's the sense I get from the historical background that you've given us. But between 2014 and 2022, there were further developments. As you pointed out, the pro-Russian president was overthrown in a civilian coup in 2014. Then there was a period of some confusion where the likes of Yulia Tymoshenko, the female politician, became prime minister for a bit. And then before there was elections, and then the candy magnate, Petro Poroshenko, became president. And he tended to, again, tilt in the direction of the West, I guess. And then, of course, before Volodymyr Zelensky. So could you now, I mean, because these were periods when you served up until 2014 in Ukraine. You're very familiar with the country. And there are those who have said historically Ukraine is even older than the Russia Federation as a country. So where did they get it wrong, in your view? Was it that they were being naive, or was it that they were goaded into what has now become this crisis that is virtually leading to the destruction of their country?
Well, that's a very good question. I don't think anybody was goaded in Ukraine. They had a clear vision of what we wanted to do. For the first 13 years of independence, they were pro-Russia, and they didn't see any change in their lives. And when they looked over their shoulders to the West, to the Baltic States of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, they saw the progress those three countries were making, because those countries from the outset knew exactly they wanted to go pro-West. And what aided their decision was that culturally, they've never had any affinity with Russia, unlike Ukraine, that is culturally very, very close to the Russians. You're right in saying that Ukraine as an entity is older than Russia. In fact, King Volodymyr in the 9th century was the king who founded Russia. But over the centuries, Russia became more powerful and incorporated Ukraine within its fold. So that culturally, they are very, very close. But as people became aware at the dawn of the new millennium, it became very clear that they didn't want to continue with the old ways. If their lives were not changing, what was the point being very close to Russia, seeing particularly the progress those three Baltic states were making? So that was why they now decided that this was the way they wanted to go. So it wasn't a question of any prompting from outside, though they did have some help in trying to oust the then President Yanukovych. But clearly, it was a homegrown revolution, so to speak.
You have referenced the Baltic states. You've talked about Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. These were all within Russia, then Soviet Union, rather, orbit before the dissolution of the Soviet Union and then the independence of all those places. Those countries went on subsequently to join either the European Union or NATO, or in some cases, both of them. And even though Russia complained that this was not in the spirit of the agreement that was reached when the Soviet Union was to be broken up, that there wouldn't be an attempt to take over anybody's sphere of influence, that the West continued to breach that agreement, but they didn't do anything practical about that until this case of Ukraine. So I guess the answer you gave in the last question, where you talked about the cultural affinity of Ukraine, would partly explain why Ukraine's case is different. But what are the other reasons why there's a difference?
Well, one very obvious reason was the weakness of Russia at this point in time. In the early 90s, during the rule of Boris Yeltsin, the Russian economy was flowing downwards. It wasn't strong. So the military itself wasn't well looked after. So militarily, Russia was not strong at that point in time. And if you recall, in the mid-90s, they had this crisis in Chechnya. And the Russian army went in there. And for 3 years, they couldn't defeat those rebels. In fact, people believed that Russia was defeated in that first phase of the war. And that really went to underscore how dilapidated the great Soviet military of that era had become. So it was only when Putin came to power, officially in the year 2000, that he started rebuilding the military. So within the next 3 years, he was able to go back to Chechnya and essentially obliterated that country, that region, rather. And that was how the Russian military became strong again. Now, the West should have known what Russia had in mind from what happened in 2008 in Georgia. If you recall, there was this invasion of Georgia by Russia, ostensibly to protect ethnic Russians in that country, but actually to stop Georgia from ever dreaming of joining either the EU or NATO. That was exactly what happened. Then Georgia was flirting with the idea of joining NATO. But after this invasion, the West became very cautious and decided to stall whatever discussions they were having with Georgia. One would have expected that the West should have taken a clear note of what happened then and be more circumspect in handling the Ukrainian situation, but it didn't do this. It was euphoric that it was able to capture so many countries within the former Warsaw Pact nations to join its fold. So we just went ahead, ignoring Russia's concern. But another question again is whether whatever agreement NATO had with Russia can stand the test of time. It wasn't a written agreement. One can say it was just a gentleman's agreement. And could the world accept that kind of agreement? The people they were having that agreement on behalf of did not participate in any discussion regarding that agreement. So how could you have an agreement on behalf of certain countries that were not party to that discussion? So I think based on that, the West just went ahead to find a way to incorporate these countries into NATO. And ostensibly, we have to thank, if I may use that word, the late Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State during the second tenure of Clinton. That was when all these efforts were made to incorporate the Eastern Bloc countries into NATO and go further afield to push those territories that used to belong to the Soviet Union. So back to your question. I think the weakness of the Russian military at that point in time did not allow Russia to take action when Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania were incorporated into NATO.
What do you think? I mean, many of us who have seen what has happened in the case of agriculture and metal supply in the last 6 or 7 weeks know now of some of the reason why Ukraine and, in fact, Russia itself is so strategic or are so strategic in world affairs. But in terms of military or diplomatic significance, other than just possibly influence, what is the strategic importance of Ukraine that makes it possible or necessary, if you like, for either NATO or the EU to be prepared in some ways to confront Russia? And why is Russia prepared as well to confront this power blocks over Ukraine? What is in Ukraine, shall I say?
For Russia, it's more a cultural thing. From the outset, they've instilled in their people that there's no difference between Ukraine and Russia, and that anybody trying to take Ukraine away from Russian orbit will now be creating an existential threat to Russia. So that's the way it's been within their mindset. So that is why they will never allow Ukraine to leave their orbit. For the West, pushing Ukraine, a very powerful country, so to speak, in its own right, is the breadbasket of that region, number one. And it does have some rare metals too the West could use, in advancing its military inventions and what have you. Weakening Russia further by pushing Ukraine is the essential goal of NATO. And that is why they are so keen having Ukraine within their orbit. But then there's been some resistance from countries like Germany, France, and Italy for fear of the reaction of Russia, given what happened in 2008 in the case I just discussed concerning Georgia. So that argument has been there. And Ukraine was nowhere close to joining NATO anyway because of this opposition from these three countries. But that didn't stop the West from trying to see how they could push Ukraine from the Russian orbit. So it is a strategic country within the fold there.
One other player, I know that sometimes in diplomatic language they refer to them as hegemons. The United States is one such hegemon. Russia, of course, has now stepped up to the stage with what is going on in Ukraine now can be described as a hegemon itself. And then the third hegemon is the one that I want to talk about now, which has remained strategically silent, as someone told me, and that is China. And there are those who say that, well, China is big enough, is strong enough militarily and economically, and is watching the events strategically. It has vetoed and participated in the veto of some of the resolutions aiming to censure Russia on the grounds that those resolutions were not properly crafted and all of that. And because, like Russia, it has a veto seat on the Security Council, it can do this. But there are others who are saying that China is watching what is happening because it has designs of its own. Do you think this is a fair comment? And what could those designs be? And what would be the link between this conflict and whatever it is that China may eventually have in mind?
China, like you observe, really has been somewhat silent. Initially, it was very pro-Russia, but during discussions on other issues pertaining to this crisis, it tended to abstain from voting. Abstention is one way of not pleasing one side and displeasing the other side. China's position, number one, China will want to see a weakened Western alliance, number one, because of its rising economic profile. And secondly, too, it might need in future the support of Russia should she decide to carry out her own design. And that design you were talking about is essentially concerning Taiwan. It has designs to incorporate Taiwan into the Chinese main territory. But how to go about it without incurring the wrath of the global community is what she's been skirting around for quite some time. So condemning Russia will be putting her in a tight spot should she, in future, decide to do a similar thing with respect to Taiwan. China will not be happy to see the West win this contest because that will strengthen the hands of the West and make it more difficult for her to have her own way if it came to dealing with Taiwan. So essentially, that is the kind of double role China has been playing. Chinese wealth comes essentially from trade with the West. She wouldn't want to jeopardize that too. So that's why she's been hammering on a peaceful resolution of this crisis. But she's not been able to come up with any concrete proposals on how to come about this peaceful resolution. So far, she's just been playing by the sideline, not trying to offend the West to the extent of creating problems in its trade relations with the West, and doesn't want to abandon a country she considers to be a friend. That is Russia. So that's the situation. Given our Chinese policy.
Okay, but given the situation, and why I led with that is that there are those who say that China is in a position to play a role to bring both parties, that's the Russians and the Ukrainians, to the negotiating table. We have seen several rounds of negotiations in the last 6 weeks or so since this invasion was launched. But those peace talks have been led by somewhat middle level, shall we call them, powers, not powers strong enough to provide the kind of carrots that will mean that both sides will stand something to gain. I'm talking of the likes of Turkey, the likes of Israel, and then one or two of the Middle Eastern states. What do you make first, of course, of the negotiations themselves? In themselves, do you see the possibility that this could lead us anywhere anytime soon?
Well, whenever there's crisis, there's always that desire to look for a peaceful approach to resolving that crisis. This crisis is no exception. Efforts are being made. But like I said the last time I was here, this discussion certainly will not lead to any peaceful resolution of the crisis. And the reason being that the terms and the conditions put on the table by Russia are very, very difficult for Ukraine to accept. The first condition is that Ukraine will accept to remain neutral in global affairs between Russia and the West. Ukraine is willing to do that. And being neutral means it will foreclose the idea of joining NATO. Ukraine is ready to do that. And the reason being that before the crisis, it was nowhere near joining NATO because of the opposition from countries like Germany, France, and Italy, as I mentioned earlier. But the other two conditions, that is, Ukraine signing off Crimea to Russia and recognizing the breakaway republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, would be very difficult for any Ukrainian president to accept. And that is why the peace talks are not going anywhere. Secondly, I do not think the West is keen on having any quick resolution to this crisis until they believe Russia has been sufficiently bled in this war. We may have Ukrainian officials negotiating, but I believe the strings are being pulled from the West. So Ukraine cannot go there and table conditions that are not approved, in my view, by the West. So as things stand now, there's no way we can have any peaceful resolution until the Ukrainian military has been sufficiently built up through the increased supply of arms by the West. And the stalemate is essentially created in the conflict.
But given the situation as it is now, while we're waiting for all those developments, if indeed there are people waiting, and then while the West is pulling the strings and probably not interested, as you put it, in the quick resolution of the conflict, Ukraine is being decimated, on the infrastructure, the people, the resources, and so on. Because as things stand, from everything that we have heard and from all that we see as reports out of the place, as things stand today, even though there are those who say that Ukraine is putting up a very valiant fight, the Russians are simply too strong?
Well, for now, the Russians are very strong. And frankly speaking, the difference between Ukrainian soldier and Russian soldier is only in the area of armaments and ammunition. But in terms of training, they both have the Soviet traditional training background. And I can say that to some extent, the Ukrainian soldier might be doing better because in addition to that old Soviet military tradition, he does have NATO military tradition, which has been brought into Ukraine since 2014 through training by both British and American soldiers. So in a way, marginally, man to man, I can say that Ukrainian soldiers are stronger and better trained. Thirdly, they do have the motivation because they are fighting for their fatherland. The Russians who are fighting kids from 18 years and above, all their lives have been taught to believe that Ukrainians are cousins. So they cannot understand why now they are supposed to be fighting their cousins over an issue they rarely understand. Now, Ukraine is being systematically destroyed. There's no doubt about that. In wars, infrastructural destruction is a basic fact. There's nothing Ukraine can do to stop that. Because as things stand now, Russia is not even willing to withdraw until those conditions it tabled are met. And like I said before, there's no Ukrainian president that's going to accept those conditions. So unfortunately, the war is going to continue. We're going to see further destruction of Ukrainian territory and infrastructure. It's unfortunate, but that's the reality of the situation.
We are seeing pictures, and when I say we, I mean in this part of the world, on the African continent, in Nigeria, we're seeing pictures of the destruction, pictures of people being killed and injured and all of that. But you served in Ukraine, and that wasn't the country in which you served. What type of a country was Ukraine, or is Ukraine, pre this invasion? Was it a jolly place? Because you had the benefit that most Nigerians don't of seeing it up close and firsthand at a time of peace.
Yeah, during my time there, I had a very great time because the people were very warm and friendly and very peaceful. All they wanted was to have an opportunity to develop their economy. And they believed the only way they could do that was to align with the West, join the EU, so they can get the kind of benefits they see the Baltic States getting. That's all they wanted. They never had intention on anybody's territory. So to have a quote-unquote a bully over their shoulder, deciding for them who their friends should be, was something they just couldn't understand. And this same bully they've aligned with for centuries. And they didn't see any progress in their lives. If other countries are moving forward, and this is the reason why they're moving forward, essentially because they're aligning with the West, why can't they be allowed to align with the West? They can't understand why somebody will choose his own friends and not decide who their own friends ought to be. That was the dilemma. So they just wanted to live a very peaceful and quiet life. But then the neighbor to the north will not allow them. So that is the crisis we're facing today. Consistently, from 2010, all opinion polls have showed that Ukrainians just wanted a situation where they will align with the West, make progress economically. But Russia vowed that they will never allow them to live their own orbit, and that they couldn't understand. So leading up to this crisis, this is not a country I left. Now they are battered, but they are resolved to continue fighting. And if I may just add, there's another reason why Ukrainians are so hard, so to speak, and very willing to die. From the pictures we saw, young men will escort their parents up to the Polish border, for instance, and come back to go and enlist because they are ready to die. And this is part of their culture, something they've learned over the centuries. There is an incident that happened in Ukrainian past essentially between 1932 and 1933, is known in Ukraine as Holodomor. Loosely translated, it means death by starvation. And what is this period? That was between 1932 and 1933. At this point in time, Stalin, the then head of the Soviet Union, had successfully vanquished his opponents, essentially Leon Trotsky. So now he wanted to consolidate by ensuring that communism was actually enforced in the Soviet Union. And the key tenet of communism is communalism, agricultural collectivization. So this was introduced in 1932. So what it meant was that peasants, whatever they produced, was taken over by the state, and the state will now decide what those peasants will get back according to their needs. This was strange to Ukrainian peasants particularly, and they resisted that new policy. And for resisting the policy, they paid dearly. Between 7 and 10 million people died through starvation, deliberate starvation imposed on them by the then government of the Soviet Union. And this they've never forgotten. And they made sure it remains alive by ensuring through oral tradition, books, movies, and music that succeeding generation remember what happened to their grandparents. And based on this, that is why it is difficult for them to ever forgive the Russians. So with this happening now, they are not convinced that there's no reason to ever be together with the Russians. And that's why they will continue fighting, irrespective of their weak military position, which is just for a while, if you ask me. And if you give some time, with these weapons streaming in from the West, the Ukrainian army is going to be sufficiently strong to continue fighting for as long as it takes.
Let me bring you to our own side of this. We have, ought to have taken some lessons from what has happened in the last couple of weeks, both on the diplomatic front and, of course, on the self-sufficiency front, value addition front. All that is economic. But on the level, let me start, of course, with the diplomatic front, the foreign policy. Prior to this crisis, and I've spoken to quite a number of your colleagues about this, I'm not too sure of the viability or the clarity in Nigeria's policy towards European countries. And that was brought to stark reality when we had to arrange for the evacuation on an emergency basis of many of the citizens, students, professionals, and so on, from Ukraine and its neighbors, where they were able to flee, the likes of Poland, Hungary, Romania, and so on. Do you think that Nigeria as a country has the right policy framework to deal with existential crises like this when they occur and when its citizens are affected?
Well, it's been a problem for quite a while, and for a lot of people, they believe Nigeria is not very proactive when it comes to issues like this. But in this case, I think it's difficult to really blame the government if you look at how the whole thing unfolded. Apart from the United States and Britain, nobody really believed, actually, that Russia was going to invade. But because of their superior intelligence, America knew Russia was going to invade. Even the Ukrainian government did not believe Russia was going to invade. And it was even downplaying the rhetoric coming from the West at that point in time. So everybody was assured that things will return to normal. And there's no way the Nigerian government can act outside the advice it gets from her ambassador in Ukraine. And the ambassador, before he sent any advice, he got information from the government, he got information from fellow ambassadors through their ambassadorial meetings. So essentially, the advice the Nigerian government got was that things were okay, that things would not escalate beyond what it was then. But it appeared that everybody got it all wrong when it did happen. And when it happened, there was no way the airspace was closed. So there's nothing the government could have done with respect to going directly to Ukraine to try to evacuate these people. But I recall that our foreign minister did have interaction with his counterpart in Ukraine, and arrangements were made on how to create safe passage for Nigerian students, particularly those in the region of Sumy to the north of Ukraine. And for those who were able to find their way to the neighboring countries, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and the rest, the government did try a lot, by arranging evacuation flights for them. So in this circumstance, it's difficult to really blame the government because nobody really believed the invasion was going to happen. So I think it was a clear case of deception from the outset. Let's just say the entire world was deceived by the Russians, with the exception of the Americans and the British, who succeeded in evacuating some of their citizens before the actual invasion started.
That brings me to the other side of policy, of course, which is how countries arrange their relationships for mutual benefit. On this level, Nigeria is not unique, so I'm going to make it Africa-wide now and ask about, it does appear that with the possible exception of South Africa, which has taken a firm, decisive stand against siding with anybody in particular, because it said it had friendships with both sides. The rest of the continent is a spectator in all of this. I doubt up until now that the African Union has issued a statement that encompasses the position of the countries in Africa on this crisis and what they want to see happen. Again, does this not speak to the weakness of, shall we say, bilateral institutions when the chips are really down?
The AU is a conglomeration of different countries, and these different countries have their own different policies towards these two countries in question, Ukraine and Russia. Countries like Angola, Mozambique, they have very close relationship with Russia. So it's difficult to expect them to take a stance, in favor of one side or the other. And that is the situation for so many African countries. That is why the AU cannot have a common, coherent policy towards this issue. And you wouldn't really blame that organization. Now, South Africa can come out and take the position it has taken, I don't think South African position is any different from Nigeria's position. Nigeria is not taking sides with anybody. We may have voted in favor of a particular resolution at a point in time. We are not voting in favor of a particular country, but in favor of the norms of international law. That's exactly what we did. And if it did appear that we're siding one side, well, it should be seen within the context of supporting international law. So we are not taking any position against any particular country because we do have good relations with both countries. Russia is the third largest exporter of wheat to Nigeria. And we do import quite a lot too from Ukraine. And we have our students studying in Ukraine. So there's no way we will be seen, to take side in this kind of conflict. But we do stand for certain things in our policy, We are against the idea of one country, trying to extinguish the sovereignty of another country. So in that respect, we took a stance. But that stance is not in favor of any particular country against the other, but in favor of maintaining international law and supporting international institutions like the United Nations. So that's what we did. But the AU cannot come out and say this is the position it's taking because there are so many countries within AU and they have different policies towards these two countries. So I cannot blame the AU for the position it's taking. You're right, militarily we're not strong and we don't want to take a position that will create problem for the continent in future. And that brings me to this recent vote in the United Nations General Assembly, where Russia was suspended from the Human Rights Council. Nigeria abstained. But before the abstention, there was this threat from Russia that anybody who voted in favor of the resolution or abstained would be deemed to be enemy of Russia one way or the other. And that wasn't healthy or helpful. Prior to this resolution, people had always abstained if they didn't want to offend one side or the other. But to now equate abstention with being same as voting in favor of that particular resolution wasn't helpful, in my view, in trying to get Russia to come back within the international fold. Yeah, it was a wrong move on their part, if you ask me. And they've just threatened that it's going to have effect on their bilateral relation with such countries. That is not helpful. And that could be one reason why so many countries have difficulty really associating with Russia. Because their type of relationship is one where they always want to have their way through use of force. And that is wrong in international relations, if you ask me.
If I move from the African Union and I go to the United Nations, and I take it from the logic that you've given that, so many of the countries have disparate policies towards Russia and towards Ukraine, and therefore synthesizing those views and arriving at a common position is very, very difficult, if not impossible. At the level of the United Nations, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is just the latest example. Down from 1945 to date, over the 70-odd years, we have seen the United Nations be ignored, be looked at as irrelevant by a group of hegemons, particularly those on the Security Council, when they believe that their interests are at stake. If the I remember very clearly when the United States was to go into Iraq, and the late General Powell, Colin Powell, went to the United Nations to try to persuade them to see what he was or what the U.S. was talking about, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. But they weren't convinced, and therefore they didn't. The United Nations as a body didn't support that invasion. But the U.S. went ahead anyway, and almost 20 years later, the UN has been proved right. No weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq, in spite of everything that then subsequently happened. The same happened in Afghanistan when the Russians invaded Afghanistan in 1979. The same happened when America went into Panama and Grenada, when Britain went into the Falklands before that. So we have a lot of examples of various countries, including those who should be leading, taking positions that do not support or that are not supported by the body. I guess the question then is, what is the relevance of these bodies, and why should one country belong to them if, when the chips are down, it cannot do anything practical about the situation?
Well, it's a clear case where you have a distinction between realism and idealism. The ideal situation is just what you've painted, having the UN live up to the vision of its founders. But the real situation is where big power politics determines what the UN does. The UN is as strong as the Security Council wants it to be. And if you notice where no Security Council member has interest, a crisis in any part of the world where no member of the Security Council has interest, the UN is very quick to resolve that crisis. But where the culprit is a member of the Security Council, it is difficult for the UN to have a say in how to resolve that conflict, essentially because of the use of the veto to make sure the UN is incapacitated. And that's exactly what happened in these instances you gave. Well, in spite of all this, the UN is still a relevant institution. Let's take the case of this Russian invasion. Yeah, the UN was not able to do anything because a member of the Security Council is involved in the crisis directly. But then it's still playing humanitarian roles in the refugee camps in Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, Moldova, and all those places. To that extent, we still believe the UN is relevant. It's better we have it the way it is than not have it at all. If you recall, the precursor to the UN, the League of Nations, was very, very ineffective. And the reason why it was ineffective was because there was nobody like the Security Council that was supposed to show clear leadership. And this was supposedly the reason why the UN was created and the Security Council was created. If it has not lived to its vision, it is because of big power politics. But at the end of the day, it's still better to have the UN the way it is than not to have it at all.
Some have talked about reforming it, but reforming it is a case of the chicken and the egg. Which one comes first? Who is to carry out the reform, which is impossible without the support of those who have made the reform necessary, so to speak? And these are the people you've referenced who are on the Security Council.
Nobody sits in a meeting where its own dissolution is going to be discussed. So certainly, I cannot see any meaningful change within the UN system as it is now, if it's going to lead to dilution of the powers of members of the Security Council, or if it's going to lead to an increase in that body, particularly since there's this divide now. China and Russia from the east, then the other three from the west. China and Russia will not want any other country that has sympathies for the West to be co-opted into the council, aka Germany or Japan. The same way too, the current three members from the West, the US, Britain, and France, will likewise not want any country that has sympathy for these two other countries from the East becoming a member of the Security Council. So honestly, I don't see how we're going to reform the UN. We may be able to reform other bodies, but the Security Council is going to be a hard nut to crack. We just have to find a way to live with the current situation the way we have it. There's no way I think this body can be reformed, given the stance of both parties. What is happening in this crisis has now shown the clear divide between China and Russia on one hand, then US, France, and Britain on the other. There's going to be a hard nut trying to reform that body. And if you can't reform the Security Council, reforming any other body of the UN will not take the institution very far, in my view.
My final question to you is that is to end the way we started, which is, from everything you've said in this interview, it would appear as if you think that this situation in Ukraine will go on for quite a while, and a stalemate will be achieved, and then perhaps dialogue will follow that. Have I read you correctly?
Yes, you have.
If that is the case, then we're in for a long slog.
Yeah, unfortunately so. Unfortunately so. I wish it was the other way around. But from the look of things, this is the way I believe it's going to go. Because certainly Russia will not just pull out. Irrespective of all the sanctions in place, Russia will just pull out. And then what I expect, like you asked last time, we need to have a mediator that is trusted by both sides. But for the mediation to work, there has to be some parity in the military positions of both countries. The way it is now, Russia essentially has the upper hand, but the plan of the West is to build up Ukrainian military to the extent of having parity or near enough parity so that both sides will now be able to sit down and talk realistically. And if you ask me how I think this case should be resolved to the benefit of both Russia and Ukraine, it's for them to change the constitution of Ukraine. Ukraine currently is a unitary state where all the decisions are taken in Kyiv, the capital. I wish they have a kind of federation like Nigeria has. That way, local issues will be dealt by the regions, so that the ethnic Russians will have a sense of belonging in those two breakaway republics and wouldn't want to depend on the center for most of their needs. And we just leave the center to handle essential things like defense and currency and what have you. So if we have this kind of situation, I think we can come close to satisfying both Russia and Ukraine. But it's going to take a while, before both sides will come to realize the importance of having this kind of arrangement.
Your Excellency, I want to thank you very much for your time and for your perspective on the program. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure being here too. Thank you so much.
That's our program today. We would, of course, like to hear from you on the conversation. Our social media handles are right there on your screen. You can also listen to this and previous episodes of the program via our podcast. Please visit our website, channelstv.com, to get started. I'm Ladi Akeredoluale. Goodbye.